The Message Bible, February 24th, Leviticus chapter 15, verse 1 through chapter 16, verse 28. God spoke to Moses and Aaron. Speak to the people of Israel. Tell them, when a man has a discharge from his genitals, the discharge is unclean. Whether it comes from a seepage or an obstruction, he is unclean. He is unclean all day. His body has a seepage or an obstruction. Every bed on which he lies is ritually unclean. Everything on which he sits is unclean. If someone touches his bed or sits on anything he sat on, or touches the man with the discharge, he has to wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, that person has to wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Every saddle on which the man with the discharge rides is unclean. Whoever touches anything that has been under him becomes unclean until evening. Anyone who carries such an object must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He remains unclean until evening. If the one with the discharge touches someone without first rinsing his hands with water, the one touched must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He remains unclean until evening. If a pottery container is touched by someone with a discharge, you must break it. A wooden article is to be rinsed in water. When a person with a discharge is cleansed from it, he is to count off 7 days for which his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe in running water. Then he is clean. On the 8th day, he is to take 2 doves or 2 pigeons and come before God at the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest then offers one as an absolution offering and one as a whole burnt offering, and makes atonement for him in the presence of God because of his discharge. When a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his entire body in water. He remains unclean until evening. Every piece of clothing and everything made of leather which gets semen on it must be washed with water. It remains unclean until evening. When a man sleeps with a woman and has an emission of semen, both are to wash in water. They remain unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge of blood, the impurity of her menstrual period lasts 7 days. Anyone who touches her is unclean until evening. Everything on which she lies or sits during her period is unclean. Anyone who touches her bed or anything on which she sits must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with her and her menstrual blood gets on him, he is unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies becomes unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, but not at the time of her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond the time of her period, she is unclean, the same as during the time of her period. Every bed on which she lies during the time of the discharge, and everything on which she sits becomes unclean, the same as in her monthly period. Anyone who touches these things becomes unclean and must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she is to count off 7 days. Then she is clean. On the 8th day, she is to take 2 doves or 2 pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest will offer one for an absolution offering and the other as a whole burnt offering. The priest will make an atonement for her in the presence of God because of the discharge that was made her unclean. You are responsible for keeping the people of Israel separate from that which makes them ritually unclean, lest they die in the unclean condition by defiling my dwelling which is among them. These are the procedures to follow for a man with a discharge or an emission of semen that makes him unclean, and for a woman in her menstrual period, any man or woman with a discharge, and also for a man who sleeps with a woman who is unclean. After the death of Aaron's 2 sons, they died when they came before God with strange fire. God spoke to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron not to enter into the Holy of Holies, barrage inside the curtain that's before the atonement cover on the chest whenever he feels like it, lest he die, because I am the priest in the cloud over the atonement cover." This is the procedure for Aaron when he enters the holy place. He will bring a young bull for an absolution offering and a ram for a whole burnt offering. He will put on the holy linen tunic and the linen underwear, tie the linen sash around him, and put on the linen turban. These are the sacred vestments, so he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. Then, from the Israelite community, he will bring 2 male goats for an absolution offering and a whole burnt offering. Aaron will offer the bull for his own absolution offering in order to make atonement for himself and his household. Then he will set the 2 goats before God at the entrance to the tent of meeting and cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for God and the other lot for Azazel. He will offer the goat on which the lot to God falls as an absolution offering. The goat on which the lot for Azazel falls will be sent out into the wilderness to Azazel to make atonement. Aaron will present his bull for an absolution offering to make atonement for himself and his household. He will slaughter his bull for the absolution offering. He will take a censer full of burning coals from the altar before God and 2 handfuls of finely ground aromatic incense, and bring them inside the curtain and put the incense on the fire before God. The smoke of the incense will cover the atonement cover, which is over the testimony, so that he doesn't die. He will take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the atonement cover, then sprinkle the blood before the atonement cover 7 times. Next, he will slaughter the goat designated as an absolution offering for the people and bring the blood inside the curtain. He will repent what he has done with the bull's blood, sprinkling it on and before the atonement cover. In this way he will make atonement for the Holy of Holies because of the uncleanness of the Israelites, their acts of rebellion, and all their other sins. He will do the same thing for the tent of meeting, which dwells among the people in the midst of their uncleanness. There is to be no one in the tent of meeting from the time of Aaron going in to make atonement in the Holy of Holies until he comes out, having made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole community of Israel. Then he will come out to the altar, that is, before God, and make atonement for it. He will take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and smear it all around the 4 horns of the altar. With his finger he will sprinkle some of the blood on it 7 times to purify and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the Israelites. When Aaron finishes making atonement for the Holy of Holies, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he will bring up the live goat, lay both hands on the live goat's head, and confess all the iniquities of the people of Israel, all of their acts of rebellion, all their sins. He will put all the sins on the goat's head and send it off into the wilderness, led out by a man standing by the ready. The goat will carry all the iniquities to an empty wasteland. The man will let him loose out there in the wilderness. Finally, Aaron will come into the tent of meeting and take off the linen clothes in which he dressed to enter the Holy of Holies and leave them there. He will bathe in water in a holy place, put on his priestly vestments, offer the whole burnt offering for himself and the whole burnt offering for the people, make atonement for himself and the people, and burn the fat of the absolution offering on the altar. The man who takes the goat out to the Ezraelis in the wilderness will wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. After that, he will be permitted to come back into the camp. The bull for the absolution offering and the goat for the absolution offering, whose blood has been taken into the Holy of Holies to make atonement, are to be taken outside the camp and burned, their hides, their meat, and their entrails. The man assigned to burn them up will then wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. Then he is free to come back into the camp. Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through 23. The Pharisees, along with some religion scholars who had come from Jerusalem, gathered around him, Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples weren't being careful with their ritual washings before meals. The Pharisees, Jews in general, in fact, would never eat a meal without going through the motions of a ritual hand washing, with an especially vigorous scrubbing if they had just come from the market, to say nothing of the scouring they'd give jugs and pots and pans. The Pharisees and religion scholars asked, "Why do your disciples brush off the rules, showing up at meals without washing their hands?" Jesus answered, "Isaiah was right about frauds like you. Hit the bullseye, in fact. These people make a big show of saying the right thing, but their hearts, they're not right and not in it. They act like they are worshiping me, but they don't mean it. They just use me as a cover for teaching whatever suits their fancy, ditching God's command and taking up the latest fads." He went on, "Well, good for you. You get rid of God's commands so you won't be inconvenienced in following the religious fashions." Moses said, "Respect your father and mother, and anyone denouncing father or mother should be killed." But you weasel out of that by saying that if perfectly acceptable to say to father or mother, "Gift, what I owed you, I've given as a gift to God," thus revealing yourself of obligation to father or mother. You scratch out God's word and scrawl a whim in its place. You do a lot of things like this. Jesus called the crowd together again and said, "Listen now, all of you, take this to heart. It's not what you swallow that pollutes your life. It's what you vomit. That's the real pollution." When he was back home after being with the crowd, his disciples said, "We don't get it." "Put it in plain language." Jesus said, "Are you being wittily stupid? Don't you see that what you swallow can't contaminate you? It doesn't enter your heart, but your stomach, works its way through the intestines, and is finally flushed." That took care of dietary quabbles. Jesus was saying that all food are fit to eat. He went on, "It's what comes out of a person that pollutes. Obscenities, lusts, thefts, murders, idolatries, greed, depravity, deceptive dealings, carousing, mean looks, slander, arrogance, foolishness. All those are vomit from the heart. There is the source of your pollution. Psalms 40, chapter 40, verse 11 through 17. Now, God, don't hold out on me. Don't hold back your passion, your love and truth are all that keeps me together. When troubles ganged me on me, a mob of sins past counting, I was so swamped by guilt, I couldn't see my way clear. More guilt in my heart than hair on my head, so heavy the guilt that my heart gave out. Soften up, God, and intervene, hurry, and get me some help. So those who are trying to kidnap my soul will be embarrassed and lose face. So anyone who gets a kick out of making me miserable will be heckled and disgraced. So those who pray for my ruin will be booed and jeered without mercy. But all who are haunting for me, oh, let them sing and be happy. Let those who know what you are all about tell the world you're great and not quitting. And me, I'm a mess. I'm nothing and have nothing. Make something of me. You can do it. You've got what it takes. But God, don't put it off. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 13 through 14. You'll find wisdom on the lips of a person of insight, but the short-sighted needs of a slap in the face. The wise accumulate knowledge, a true treasure. Know-it-alls talk too much, a sheer waste. That was the reading for February 24th. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening.